I'd like to return to one last issue before we finish, and that's the normative question that you hinted at a little earlier. So you wrote a paper relatively recently, I think, called Realism and Relativism about the normative that I wanted to ask you about. And of course, getting into metaethics is a bit far from where we started, though I'll flag that there are obviously non-ethical normative issues, like you mentioned, rationality is one in this paper. But you advocate what I already referred to as an anti-nihilist position about normative facts, namely that there are some of them. And while I can agree that hopefully, there are non-normative facts about, say, the weight of the podcat, on what basis are there facts about how one ought to treat cats? So, namely, how can it be a fact that I ought not to hit her? And I think you quote John Mackey on this, and I really appreciated this, but he says that if there are moral properties or things like this, they have to be entities or qualities very, very strange and different from the other kinds that we're used to measuring and observing and quantifying maybe in our daily or scientific practices. And this, of course, I'll just say again, is a huge issue, so I don't expect us to entirely unravel, but I just like to get the gist of your basis for thinking that there are such facts.
Yeah, this is something that's been preoccupying me a great deal, and I would be the first to admit that, the idea that there are primitive normative facts, and I'll explain in a second why it has to be primitive normative facts, that so that in a sense the world itself has a view about whether you ought or ought not to hit your cat just for your own amusement, can strike you as a very puzzling thing, because it's as though, well, the sphericity of the earth, we know what it is, and we know where to find it and what it looks like and how to measure it and determine whether it's true and so on and so forth. But these ought facts, what are they and where do they reside and where do they come from? Now, in the old days, of course, people thought, no, they weren't just sitting out there. They were the contents of God's commands. So you had these mind-dependent views of normativity, either in an infinite mind like God's, or even in the finite minds of idealized human judges. So there are many theories like that try to tame normativity into something that we can understand because it's the deliverance of a certain kind of idealized judgment. But I don't believe any of those reductionist accounts can work. And so the kind of normativity to which I'm committed, and you can show why they don't work, is a primitive normativity, just a primitive fact about the world that certain things ought not to be done, or that there is at least reason not to do them, which is not itself based on the evaluative judgment of any particular mind. And now, if you ask, well, what's your basis for thinking? Well, you can perfectly well understand the definition of such a property and the fact that people have believed in such properties and so on. But what's our basis for thinking that any such thing is real? And, part of the answer is that it's very hard to see how to make sense of any judgment if facts about what it's justified to believe are not real. So, everything I'm saying, including if I say with Mackey is a very interesting case because he he formulated this kind of canonical skepticism about normative properties and their existence. And he made the point that this would apply to judgments about morality and also judgments about aesthetics. He saw aesthetics and morality as both normative. But he didn't notice that judgments about epistemic justification are also normative. And so that if you're going to be a skeptic about the existence of normative properties in the way that Mackey was, then you have to be equally skeptical about the idea that there is a fact of the matter which judgments are justified and which ones are not, whether it be a priori or a posteriori justification. And I don't think we can make sense of what we are doing in putting forward any judgment without the idea that that judgment is justified as opposed to not justified, that it is the right thing to believe given the evidence, or it is the right thing to believe given the considerations, the a priori considerations that have been put forward. So I have lots and lots of reason for taking seriously the idea that there are some normative properties, especially the ones pertaining to epistemic rationality or justification. Now, if I have that, then I may have justification for believing that there are as many normative properties as there seem to be, in particular, given certain very non-negotiable judgments about morality, that there are facts about those as well. I happen to believe that, unfortunately, the same strength of case can't be made for aesthetic normative properties as you can make for both morality and rationality. So the question then becomes, look, you certainly have lots and lots of prima facie reason for taking the existence of such properties seriously. Can you overcome the objections that people have made to their existence? So in particular, the metaphysical objection that you mentioned from Mackey, and the epistemological objection that we don't have a good account of how we know these things. And the answer is, I can answer both the metaphysical objection and the epistemological objection. And that's part of the reason, by the way, why the theory of the a priori is so important, is because it's needed as an answer to the question how you could know such basic normative principles at all.
If you'll permit me just a brief rejoinder, which of course you could, I hope you will tell me where I'm wrong, but I think you say something to the effect that it's hard to make sense of any judgment about these issues if there are no underlying facts or properties here. And take Pins the podcat, for example, who is often, today she's been good, but swatting at the camera, things like that. And I do have the urge to swat her occasionally. But because of the way that my brain is wired up, I have a lot of affection for this creature. And it is on the basis of this raw brain-mediated feeling that I have for her that I make the judgment that it's bad to hit her. And in this case, I don't see a need to postulate some primitive normative fact in the situation. It's just something that is a system that is constructed based on the way that I feel about the world.
Well, I think if you examine the full range of things that you believe in the normative domain, in the ethical domain, you will find that that's not an adequate explanation of moral judgment, not even as a descriptive matter. So you certainly wouldn't think that if we had all been wired up to not have such qualms about slavery, then that would mean that slavery was okay. I would assume that you yourself would not agree that there is that kind of transition from what we would be disposed to judge given our internal subjective feelings and what would actually be right. I mean, to take other examples, there are things that people may be highly repelled by as a phenomenological matter, and yet, can very well see that there is nothing immoral about the thing that is repelling them, and so on. So I think you will find that you yourself believe yourself to have access to a kind of normative judgment about what is morally right that isn't fully explained or justified by variable subjective feelings that you may have.
One problem I have, or maybe two problems I have with the slavery example, are one that it is so charged that nobody in their right mind would ever consider pushing back against it. But then the other is that it is condoning slavery is so far from how I'm wired, I guess, at least based on, I mean, because presumably if I was born 500 years ago, I would feel differently. But how I am now, it's impossible for me to entertain it being something acceptable. But to take a much less charged example, I mean, right now we all think, well, maybe we don't all think, but when I see somebody spitting on the ground on the sidewalk, I think that that's and this is charged way to put it, but a morally repugnant act. But I can totally imagine another possible world in which we don't have this aversion to spitting in public, where I don't take any umbrage with it.
Right. I mean, the fact that, as you say, if you'd been born 500 years ago, maybe you would have had a different attitude towards slavery shows you that really the wiring metaphor is wrong here. It's not about being wired, because if wiring is something invariant, right, presumably, across cultural and temporal changes. And so it's not a matter of wiring. Yeah, it's true. We're brought up to make certain moral judgments and not others. And depending on where we're brought up, we will have been brought up with respect to various things to have divergent views about them. For instance, there are many people who think it's morally wrong to educate girls and young women, right? Even now in the world, strange as it may be. So, but if you look, the subjective feelings can be all over the place. If what you were saying is true, that the you see, the theory can't be that the justification that anyone has for their moral views is what their subjective feelings are, right? Because it would just be true as a matter of the relevant counterfactuals that if our subjective feelings about slavery had not changed, then that would mean that there would be nothing wrong with slavery. And I don't believe that you believe that. That counterfactual. Now there are things that people say about this. They say we can rigidify, but if you actually look at what's entailed by that picture, it yields nothing plausible. So it's I think the suggestion that when I say that something is morally right or wrong, this is just some kind of slightly obfuscatory way of saying I approve of it or I don't approve of it. I think that can be shown to be completely wrong.